She was told the Americans would break her bones, then her spirit. Instead, a man in a cowboy hat tipped his brim, pointed to his bed, and said in slow, careful English, "She sleeps in my bed." Her heart stilled. The barracks behind her loomed like wooden cages. She braced for mockery, for humiliation. But what followed wasn't what anyone expected. The young Japanese woman, barely 21, had survived the jungle, the bombing, the hunger. Now she stood on the porch of an American ranch house, thousands of miles from the Pacific Islands where she'd been captured. A worn plaid quilt fluttered on the line. A pot of chili simmered on the stove, and the man, her supposed jailer, was handing her a cup of warm milk. "You don't sleep on the floor anymore," he said. She couldn't move, not out of fear, but disbelief, because everything she had been taught about the enemy was breaking, one soft moment at a time. The morning they were loaded onto the trucks, no one spoke, not really. A few whispered prayers, one clutched a scrap of cloth from her mother's old kimono, but most simply stared at the rising dust as tires churned up the dry ground. For months they had lived behind wire, barbed, tangled, merciless. The fences had defined their world, a geometry of shame. Now, without warning, those fences were behind them. Wooden slats of the flatbed rattled beneath their thighs, the wind snapped at their threadbare uniforms, and the soldiers seated near the front didn't even seem to be watching them. That, somehow, was worse than a threat. It meant something was coming, something unexpected. One woman, her name barely remembered after years of being referred to only by number, watched the trees give way to endless sky. She had grown up with the sea close enough to taste it in her food. Here, everything was dust, space, and silence. No sirens, no shouting, just wind. She turned to the woman beside her, another nurse from Okinawa, and tried to form the question they were all thinking. "Where are they taking us?" The nurse shrugged. The same shrug she'd given when the bombs came. The same shrug when they'd been told the war was over. Hours passed. Somewhere behind them, the camp faded into memory. Somewhere ahead, America loomed. Not the monster they'd feared, but a landscape so vast it made them feel small in new and terrible ways. Then the truck stopped. The women were told to get out. They stepped into heat. Not the choking, wet heat of the jungle. This was dry, cracking, a sun that stripped shadow from the earth. In front of them stood men, but not the kind they expected. Not soldiers in pressed green or snarling commanders with batons. These men wore boots caked in red clay, dust-colored shirts, and wide hats that shaded their eyes. One leaned against a fence post, chewing something that looked like straw. Another tipped his hat and nodded like they were neighbors. Cowboys. Real ones. No one moved at first. The guards didn't bark orders. The cowboys didn't leer or laugh. Instead, one of them pointed at the barn and said something too fast to catch. Then, slower, clearer, in broken syllables, he added, "You help. Here. Work." It made no sense. Were they being transferred to a labor camp? A farm? Was this a punishment or something else? The cowboy gestured again, not angrily, just waiting. And when the women finally followed, their footsteps unsure, it was like crossing an invisible border. The land didn't feel like enemy territory. It felt, strangely, normal. They were shown the ranch house first. Long porch, swing creaking in the breeze, a dog lying in the shade, not even lifting its head. Inside, the scent of something strange and wonderful clung to the air. Spices, beans, something roasted. A woman with graying hair and rough hands handed them mugs of water without saying a word. One of the women, parched and trembling, drank too, fast and coughed. The older woman reached out, gently patted her back. No cruelty, no scolding, just kindness. Out back, the fields stretched on forever, rows of cotton, chickens in coops, horses whickering behind wooden fences. It wasn't paradise, but it wasn't a prison. Later, as they were shown where they'd sleep, inside, on real beds, under real roofs, the disbelief turned to something harder. Suspicion. What was this? What trick was being played? They had heard stories of Americans using comfort to shame prisoners into cooperation. Was that this? Or had the war really changed shape? That night, lying beneath a quilt someone had hand-stitched, one of the women whispered into the darkness, "Why is it softer here than it ever was at home?" No one answered, but the question lingered, heavy and unanswered, as if the dry wind itself was waiting for them to understand. That evening, as the sun dropped low across the Texas horizon and the sky flared orange behind the ridgeline, the women stood in silence outside the ranch house. The cowboy pointed toward the screen door and then looked at the young Japanese nurse standing nearest. She couldn't have been more than 21. Her hair was pulled back with a cloth tie, her shoes worn nearly to paper. He motioned gently, then said the words that stopped every breath in the yard. "She sleeps in my bed." Time froze. The other women stiffened. The nurse felt the blood leave her face. This was it. This was what they had feared, what they had whispered about in barracks, what the pamphlets had warned them of. That captivity would become something darker. That kindness was only a mask for conquest. She backed away instinctively, the doorframe a jagged outline in her vision. But the cowboy's expression didn't change. He raised his palms slowly and added, "I sleep floor, you bed." She didn't understand the words fully, but the gestures, the tone, they were unmistakable. He wasn't claiming the bed with her. He was giving it to her. Still, it didn't make sense. In her world, men did not yield to women. Not in war. Certainly not in defeat. And yet here he was, offering the only bed in the house and taking the floor for himself. He turned and stepped inside, leaving the door open behind him. She stood frozen for another moment before crossing the threshold. The room was small. Wood walls, a shelf lined with old paperbacks, a single photograph in a worn frame, an older woman, smiling, with 2 children. The cowboy pointed to the bed again, then to himself, then to a folded blanket and pillow set down carefully by the fireplace. "I sleep here," he said. Then he nodded once, tipped his hat, and disappeared into the back room. She stood there alone for a long time. The room smelled of cedar and smoke. Outside, the cicadas had started their slow, rhythmic call. The bed was made, clean sheets, a soft quilt that looked handmade. She sat down on the edge of the mattress and pressed her palm into it. It gave easily under her weight. Her breath caught. In the camps, they'd slept on boards, mats, when they were lucky, mostly dirt, sometimes nothing at all. She pulled the quilt back, slowly, as if it might vanish. She slid beneath it, the cool fabric brushing against her arms, and lay still. Her muscles didn't know how to relax. Her fingers gripped the edge like a ledge. She stared at the ceiling. She could hear the man's footsteps elsewhere in the house. Not loud, not pacing, just normal, unbothered. He didn't come back in, didn't speak again, didn't even look in through the crack in the door. The silence stretched on, and in that stillness the tears came. Quiet at first, just warmth against her cheeks, then shaking sobs that caught in her throat. She turned her face into the pillow and wept, not from fear, not from grief, but from something harder to name. It was the dissonance, the impossibility of it. She had been taught that the enemy would strip her, use her, break her. Instead, he had handed her the softest thing she'd touched in years and laid his own body on the floor like it was nothing. She didn't sleep at first. The softness itself felt threatening, but eventually her breath slowed. The pillow caught her tears and held them like memory. And as the wind pushed gently through the trees outside, the question returned again, deeper this time. Why would a man sleep on the floor for someone he's supposed to hate? She woke to the smell of something baking, not the charred bitterness of scorched rice or powdered rations, but warmth, yeast, flour, cinnamon maybe. Her eyes opened slowly, the quilt still curled around her shoulders. For a moment she thought she was still dreaming. Then she remembered the ceiling, the bed, the silence, and the man who had said, "You bed, I sleep here." She sat up. Her body ached in unfamiliar ways, not from pain, but from rest. She had slept deeply, too deeply, the kind of sleep that betrayed all her training, all her caution. She stepped out of the bed, her bare feet brushing against a woven rug that had once belonged to someone who cared about things like color. A blue so soft it looked like sky. The house was quiet. No guards, no barking dogs, just a ticking clock somewhere and the creak of a floorboard in another room. She followed the scent to the kitchen, where the man stood at the stove with his back turned, wearing the same dust-colored shirt, sleeves rolled up. He pointed to the table without speaking. 2 plates, 2 cups, a loaf of bread cooling on a wire rack. She hesitated, then sat. He poured coffee, black and steaming, into her cup, then showed her how to add milk. No lectures, no warnings, just a nod as if this were normal, as if sharing breakfast with a Japanese prisoner of war was something that happened every morning in rural Texas. They ate in silence. She watched him carefully, the way he chewed slowly, methodically, the way he wiped his hands on the same cloth draped over his belt. At one point he reached over and turned the dial on the radio. Static. Then soft, twanging music filled the air. English words she couldn't understand, but the melody was gentle. After breakfast he took her outside. The sun was already high. Chickens clucked from the coop, and the dry wind kicked up small clouds of dust. He pointed at a water pump and mimed what needed doing. She nodded, grateful, maybe, for the simplicity of it, of pumping water, of doing something her body could understand. The rest of the morning passed in small, quiet tasks, feeding the hens, gathering eggs, hanging a clean sheet on the line that caught the sun like a flag. She had spent years surrounded by noise, orders barked, bombs dropped, names erased. Here, the silence was so thick it felt like air pressing down. But it was not oppressive. It was unoccupied. Later, as the sun began to soften, he opened a door to a small room and then stepped back. Let her look. It was a bedroom, neatly made. A woman's scarf hung on a hook. A book lay open on the nightstand. Dust rested gently over everything. She stepped inside, then stopped. The air smelled faintly of lavender. She did not ask whose it was. She didn't need to. He said, almost too quietly to hear, "My wife, gone. Long time." She nodded, stepped out. He closed the door behind her. Something shifted in her then, a weight she hadn't noticed until it moved. The house wasn't full of threats. It was full of absence, of spaces once occupied by love and loss. That night, she sat on the porch and watched the sky change colors. She could hear him inside, moving gently. Not a warden, not a captor, just a man living in the ruins of his own war. And for the first time since her capture, she allowed herself to believe. This wasn't a prison. It wasn't even punishment. It was something else entirely. The notice came quietly, passed from one woman to another like a secret too fragile to hold. They would be allowed to write home, not dictated lines, not censored slogans, but real letters. Their own words, on paper, to be sent across oceans and silence to the families they hadn't seen in years. When the news reached her, the young nurse sat down on the porch steps and stared at her hands for a long time. She had imagined death. She had imagined disgrace. She had never imagined writing. A guard brought her paper, a pencil, and a plain envelope. No return address, no symbol of war, only space. She brought the letter inside the house and sat at the small wooden table where she had eaten breakfast that morning. The paper felt too white, the pencil too sharp. Her first attempt was only one line. "Mother, I am alive." She stared at it for minutes, then erased it, then wrote it again. But what came after that? What words could contain the truth of this place? Could she say she slept in a real bed under a quilt stitched by the enemy's wife? Could she admit that her captor poured her coffee each morning and showed her how to tune the radio? That she was clean, warm, fed? That the cowboy had given her his bed and taken the floor? She pressed the pencil down again. "Tell Mother I am not cold." Across the ranch, other women were writing too. In barns, in bunkhouses, on the backs of crates and kitchen tables. They wrestled not only with language, but with emotion. Some sat in silence for hours before putting anything to paper. Others wept as they wrote. There was no guidebook for this kind of letter, how to tell your starving family that your enemy treats you better than your own army did. Some letters were short, others were dense with small, precise details. One woman described the smell of bread baking. Another described how the wind here never screamed like it did back home. A third wrote about a rocking chair that creaked in the evenings, carrying some ancient memory of comfort. They knew the letters would be intercepted, that somewhere, in Tokyo or Osaka, a man in a uniform would read their words before any parent did. And still they wrote. Because even if the letter never made it home, the act of writing it changed something. It made the quiet real. It made the softness undeniable. For women who had been taught to expect violence, who had been told that surrender was worse than death, these letters were tiny mutinies. To say I am safe was to defy every warning. To say I am treated well was to chip away at the walls that had been built inside them since girlhood. And yet, for all the comfort, the confusion was unbearable. One woman, who had watched a comrade die from an untreated wound in the jungle, now had her bandages changed daily by a quiet, blue-eyed medic. Another had been beaten for asking for water back in the islands. Now she was handed a glass before she even had to ask. These kindnesses were not grand. They were devastating, because they made everything harder. Harder to hate, harder to justify, harder to remember which side was which. By the end of the week, a stack of letters waited in a canvas bag. The rancher handed them over to a young American corporal who promised they would go out with the next mail truck. Whether that meant they would arrive, no one could say. But the women had written them anyway. The nurse folded hers gently, pressed it into the envelope, and sealed it with a thumb that trembled. She had written more than she meant to, less than she wanted. Just before she handed it over, she whispered to it, "Don't forget me." She didn't know if she meant her mother or herself. The days began to settle into rhythm. At sunrise, the nurse rose from the cowboy's bed, still made with care each evening, and stepped barefoot into the hallway, where the scent of frying eggs and brewed coffee had already started to wrap around the wood-paneled walls. By mid-morning she was outside, sleeves rolled up, hands in the soil. She had never worked a cotton field before. None of them had. But their hands remembered labor, and in a strange way, the motion gave them something to hold on to. They picked cotton under the wide-open sky, shoulders brushing, silence shared. At first the heat was unbearable, but the body adjusts. It always does. Lunch was brought out on metal trays, beans, cornbread, water kept cool in old glass jars. No one barked orders. There were no watchtowers. Just the cowboy who handed her gloves one morning without a word, nodding toward a broken fence post. The fear, though, never left. Not really. It hid behind every laugh, every smile too wide. But the longer they worked, the harder it became to hold on to the old lines of certainty. The cowboy never asked them their names, but he never raised his voice either. When one woman tripped and cut her hand on a nail, he rapped it himself, clumsy but careful. When the chickens broke loose one morning, he chased them with a broom, shouting in a way that made the women laugh in spite of themselves. That afternoon, laughter turned into something else. The ranch wife from next door, a woman in her 50s with flour always smudged on her apron, appeared at the door with a covered dish. No explanation, just a nod. The cowboy took it, carried it to the kitchen, and revealed what was inside. Pie, peach by the smell of it, cinnamon, brown sugar, butter baked to golden crust. He set plates in front of each woman, stood back, waited. The nurse took the first bite. Sweetness, warmth, something so unfamiliar her whole face stiffened. Then, from deep inside her, a noise escaped. Laughter, sharp, startled, as if it had burst from some locked place. She covered her mouth instantly, eyes wide, but no one scolded her, no one glared. The cowboy just looked down, smiled once, and turned back to the stove. That evening they walked past the barn, a few of them singing softly, songs from home, lyrics half forgotten. Fireflies blinked along the fence line. Someone had hung a string of lights on the porch, the kind used for holidays. No one knew why. Still, the tension curled around every moment. Gratitude felt like betrayal. The softness of their days here made the memory of suffering sharper. Some began eating less, pushing food away half-finished. One woman offered to clean the latrines just to remind herself of what she'd come from. Another refused to sleep under the quilt, laying it at the foot of the bed each night like a flag she wasn't ready to carry, because guilt clung to every comfort. For every slice of pie, someone back home starved. For every smile shared, a brother's name was being carved into a monument. The nurse wrote another letter that night. Didn't send it, just folded it, placed it beneath her pillow. In it, she had written, "They give us more than we deserve. I don't know how to carry it." Out the window, the cowboy sat on the porch alone, hat pulled low, a harmonica in his lap. He didn't play it, just held it. And somewhere in the dark, the nurse whispered to herself, "Am I still a prisoner, if I don't want to leave?" The question still echoed in her chest as the sun dipped below the low hills, painting the ranch in long strokes of amber and gold. Supper had ended, and the plates had been cleared with quiet routine. The women retired to their rooms or lingered near the doorway, not ready for sleep, not quite belonging to the night. Outside, on the porch, the cowboys gathered. Not in formation, not with rank or rules. Just men, dusty from the day, boots kicked off or heels propped against railings. One of them lifted a harmonica. The first note floated out slow and unsure, like a voice clearing its throat after too long silent. Then came another, steadier. The melody that followed was faint, stumbling, but it carried. The nurse stood behind the screen door, arms folded over her chest. She wasn't alone. The others were watching too, not daring to step outside, but drawn by the softness. It was a tune none of them recognized, likely something old and American, born in fields or bars or church pews. But it wasn't the song that caught her breath. It was the ease of it, the absence of force, the way they played not for show, not for power, but because there was nothing else to fill the silence. One of the younger women, a seamstress before the war, shifted forward. She had a voice like rice paper, delicate and unsure, but that night she spoke. "Can you play something? From Japan?" The cowboy with the harmonica paused. He looked at her, then shrugged. "Don't know any," he said with a grin, "but hum it. I'll try." The girl hesitated, eyes darting toward the others, but no one stopped her. Slowly she began to hum a lullaby, old, simple, the kind mothers once sang over cribs in warm summer kitchens. Her voice shook at first, but the notes carried. The cowboy listened, nodded along, then lifted the harmonica again. What followed was a mess. The tune came out crooked, bent, lost in translation, but he kept trying, matching her melody with earnest clumsiness. On the third attempt, something like the tune appeared, and that's when she laughed. A quick, high, involuntary laugh, like a bell being struck by accident. The kind of laugh that comes from surprise more than joy. And the cowboy laughed too, rubbing the back of his neck in mock defeat. Inside, the nurse smiled. She didn't mean to, but it rose out of her anyway, uninvited. Around her, the women began to soften just slightly, shoulders untensed, arms unfolded. For a moment, they weren't prisoners, and the men outside weren't guards. They were people, fumbling toward something human in the dark. Later, as the moon climbed higher and the harmonica fell quiet, the nurse stepped outside, just far enough to sit on the edge of the porch. She didn't speak. Neither did he. The cowboy beside her offered no words, no gestures, just his presence. That was enough. The fireflies returned. So did the silence. But it was no longer the silence of threat. It was the silence of things unspoken, because they didn't need to be. She glanced at him once. He was looking up at the stars, face calm, distant, and in that moment she saw it. Not the uniform, not the nation, not the role he'd been given. She saw the boy he used to be, the father he might have become, the grief he still carried. It terrified her, because once you see the enemy smile, once you laugh at the same broken tune, you can never unsee it. And that, she realized, was its own kind of war. The next letter arrived folded thin, its edges worn soft by too many hands. The nurse recognized her mother's handwriting immediately, tight, careful, as if every stroke had to justify the ink. She read it standing by the window, the light catching dust in the air. The words were spare, but the meaning pressed hard against her chest. Rice was gone. Fuel was gone. The neighborhood well had dried. Children boiled weeds. A cousin had died quietly in the night, not from wounds, but from hunger that had simply gone too far. She lowered the letter slowly. The smell of lunch drifted in from the kitchen, beans simmering, bread warming. Her stomach tightened, not with hunger, but with something closer to nausea. That day she ate only a few bites before pushing the plate away. No one commented. The next day she ate less. The day after that she skipped the meal entirely. She wasn't alone. Across the ranch the other women were doing the same. One tucked bread into her sleeve, another hid apples beneath her mattress. One tried to slip a parcel into the outgoing mail, a careful bundle of biscuits wrapped in cloth. It was returned unopened, gently, with a note she could not read but understood all the same. You cannot send food across an ocean. The abundance here had become its own torment. Every full plate felt like theft, every warm night like betrayal. They had been taught that suffering was proof of loyalty, Now comfort arrived without asking, and it felt wrong in ways they had no words for. The invisible war grew louder. Belief told them they should refuse. Evidence told them refusal changed nothing. The rancher never forced them to eat. He never asked questions. But he watched. He noticed the half-eaten plates, the shrinking figures, the way the women folded inward as if trying to take up less space. One afternoon, the nurse sat alone at the table, staring at a bowl of stew gone cold. Her letter lay beside it, unfolded. She hadn't realized she was crying until the tears fell into the broth, blurring the surface. Her shoulders shook, silent and uncontrollable. The rancher came in quietly. He didn't startle her, didn't scold. He looked at the plate, then at her hands clenched in her lap. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said it. Not loudly, not with emphasis, just the plainest sentence he could find. "You deserve to be full." The words hit harder than any accusation. She shook her head immediately, breath hitching. She tried to explain about her mother, about the letter, about the children boiling weeds, but the language failed her. The rancher listened anyway. When she finished, he pushed the bowl back toward her, just a little. "Eating don't make it worse," he said. "Starving here won't feed them there." It was unbearable, not because he was wrong, but because he was right, and because no officer, no commander, no teacher had ever told her she deserved anything at all. That night, she ate, slowly, deliberately. Each bite felt like a confession. Across the room, another woman watched her, then picked up her own spoon. No one spoke. Later, lying awake beneath the quilt, the nurse stared at the ceiling again. But this time, the question had changed. It was no longer, "Why is he kind?" It was, "What does this kindness ask of me?" Because to accept it meant letting go of something else, letting go of the idea that pain was noble, that hunger was proof, that dignity had to be earned through suffering. Outside, the night insects sang. Inside, the rancher washed dishes, the soft clink of ceramic steady and unremarkable. The world went on, indifferent to the myths she had carried so carefully for so long. And in that quiet, devastating normalcy, something inside her finally cracked. Not loudly, not all at once, but enough to let a new, terrifying thought slip through. What if everything she had been taught about honor was wrong? Spring came late to the ranch that year. The earth was dry, stubborn from a winter that refused to loosen its grip. But the cowboy handed her a small bag of seeds and pointed to a square of earth just beyond the barn. "Yours," he said. Just that. One word. He didn't explain what to plant, or how deep, or how often to water. He simply gave her the space and the choice. She stood in the soil for a long time before kneeling. Her hands trembled as they broke the surface, not from fear, but something gentler. Reverence, maybe. Each seed was small, nearly weightless, and yet she felt as though she was burying something sacred. She didn't know if they would grow. That wasn't the point. The point was, she was the one planting them. A few days later, another woman was handed a stubby pencil and an English Bible with creased pages. "Practice," the rancher said, tapping the worn cover. The woman had once taught school before the war. Her fingers itched for chalk. Now she traced words she didn't fully understand, sounding them out softly like prayer. Not because she had been ordered, but because she wanted to remember what it meant to learn. Another was taught how to ride. A young cowboy with sun-browned skin and a crooked grin led her to the gentlest horse in the stable. The first ride was slow, unsure, awkward. The second was better. By the fifth, she was galloping across the dry fields, hair pulled back, heart thudding with something dangerously close to joy. They never spoke of it openly. That would have made it too real. But between the chores and the silences, between the meals and the music, a question began to grow like the seeds in the soil. If the enemy sees me as human, what does that make them? It was not asked in defiance. It was asked in bewilderment. Because how do you reconcile the man who taught you how to ride with the stories you'd been told since childhood? How do you align the image of the American devil with the ranch wife who brought extra pie when she heard someone had a fever? They tried to hold on to what they had been told, that Americans were cruel, that surrender was shame, that women were weapons, not people. But the evidence chipped away at belief like water against stone. One laugh, one warm cup of coffee, one clumsy harmonica tune. It didn't mean they forgave. It didn't mean they forgot. But something shifted. That night, they gathered near the garden. The first green shoots had begun to peek through the earth. The sun dipped low, casting the field in gold. The nurse knelt beside the small plants, brushing dirt from a leaf like it was something precious. The cowboy walked by, hands in his pockets, and nodded. Not with pride, not with ownership, just recognition. In the distance, another woman practiced writing. Another practiced balance in the saddle. None of it was dramatic. None of it was grand, but it was theirs. And in that stillness, beneath the wide Texas sky, they remembered something they hadn't felt in years. Choice. Not freedom, not yet, but the possibility of it. If this story resonates with you so far, like the video and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. We read every single one. It wasn't freedom, not yet, but the possibility of it. And then, one morning, the possibility was taken from her before she knew what to do with it. The cowboy came to the door with a folded paper in his hand. He didn't knock. He just stood there, eyes low, mouth tight, like a man delivering news that would bruise them both. "Orders came through," he said. "It's time." She blinked once, then again. The words didn't make sense at first. Time for what? The sky was still the same soft blue, the garden still waiting for water, the saddle still rested by the barn. But she knew, deep down, what he meant. Repatriation. The war was over. She moved slowly through the house that had once been strange and now felt carved into her skin. In her room, she laid out the few things she owned, the scarf she had mended twice, the last letter from her mother, the smooth silver hairbrush the ranch wife had handed her with an awkward hug, and the words, "For your next chapter." There was so little to carry, but it felt heavier than any pack she'd marched with. The other women moved quietly, too, their faces stunned, not with grief exactly, but something harder to name. They had spent so long preparing for return, but now that it had come, they didn't know how to feel. Some wept in silence. Some sat still for hours. One asked aloud, "Will they believe us when we tell them?" No one answered. The cowboy helped her tie the string on her bundle. He didn't say much, but as she turned to leave, he placed something small in her hand. A folded photograph, weather-worn, corners frayed. It showed the ranch, the porch, and 3 silhouettes too blurry to name. "For memory," he said. She stepped out onto the porch, the same porch where music once played, where stars had watched her learn how to forgive the sky. The truck waited by the fence line, motor low, dust gathering at its tires. They walked together, her and the cowboy. Neither spoke, but when they reached the edge of the field, he stopped, looked at her square. "Don't forget," he said, voice rough, eyes refusing to meet hers. "You're not a prisoner anymore." She wanted to believe him, but the truth pressed too hard against her chest. because freedom was not just the absence of barbed wire, it was the right to choose what to remember and what to leave behind. And the hardest part was this: she wasn't sure where home was anymore. Was it the country that had raised her in silence and sacrifice, told her who to hate and who to become? Or was it this strange, dusty house where she had learned to sleep, to laugh, to be confused by kindness? She turned once, just once, to look back. The house stood quiet. The windows reflected sky. The garden had begun to bloom. She would never forget that house. Or the man who gave her his bed and never asked her to be anything but alive. As the truck pulled away, she pressed the photograph to her chest, not for what it showed, but for what it didn't, because not everything could be captured. Some things lived only in the soil, in laughter shared in secret, in the silence between two people who had once been enemies and were, perhaps, something else entirely. The boat docked at dawn. There were no banners, no music, no welcoming crowd, just the sound of ropes thrown against wet wood and the low murmur of voices heavy with exhaustion. When she stepped onto the pier, the first thing she noticed was the smell. Ash, rot, salt. It clung to everything. The port had survived, barely, but the city beyond it looked as though it had been chewed apart and spit back out. Buildings leaned at unnatural angles. Roofs were gone. Walls were scorched black. She stood still with her bundle in hand, watching other women disembark, each one shrinking a little as reality pressed in. This was home, or what remained of it. She walked for hours through streets she once knew by heart. The shop where her mother used to buy rice was a hollowed shell. The schoolyard where children once ran was cratered and silent. When she reached the place where her house had stood, she stopped. There was nothing to mark it. No foundation, no doorway, just weeds and rubble and a fragment of roof tile half buried in dirt. A neighbor recognized her, or thought she did. The woman's eyes flicked over her clothes, her fuller face, the strange calm in her posture. "You survived," the neighbor said, not kindly, not cruelly either, just stating a fact that carried weight. Later, she learned the rest. Her brother had died months earlier, not in battle, in a shelter, during a firestorm, trapped beneath beams that once held the ceiling of their childhood home. Her mother had survived, but only just, thinner than she remembered, older. The reunion was quiet. They did not embrace for long. There were too many questions neither knew how to ask. At night, the whispers began, not loud, not direct, just enough to remind her that survival had a cost. She was captured. She lived with Americans. She looks, well. Shame settled over her like a second skin. She stopped speaking of the ranch, of the garden, of the harmonica, of the bed. When asked how she survived, she said only, "I was lucky." It was easier than explaining the unbearable truth that the enemy had treated her with dignity when her own world had collapsed. But memory is stubborn. At night, when the city fell quiet, she dreamed of wooden floors creaking under careful footsteps, of the smell of chili warming on the stove, of wind moving through open fields without the sound of sirens. She dreamed of a man placing a blanket on the floor without a word. She woke each time with her hand curled tight around something cool and smooth, the silver hairbrush, the last gift. She would sit up, breathing slow, tracing the engraved edge with her thumb, grounding herself in the knowledge that those memories were real. Once, only once, she dared to tell her mother a fragment of it, just a fragment. "They gave me a bed," she said softly. Her mother said nothing. Then, after a long silence, she nodded. "Then you must carry that with care," she replied. "Some kindness is too heavy for others to hear." Years passed. The city rebuilt itself in pieces. She found work. She married, though not for love. She learned to be quiet again, but the woman she had been on that ranch never left her. She appeared in small moments, when she chose mercy over obedience, when she spoke gently instead of harshly, when she refused to believe that suffering was the only proof of worth. She never forgot the man who had given her his bed, not his face, not his voice, not the way he had said, "You deserve to be full." And in her quietest moments, when the world felt unbearably small again, she would close her eyes and remember this truth. Once, in the land of the enemy, she had been seen, not as a prisoner, not as a symbol, but as a person. If you've made it this far, we want to hear from you. Was this story what you expected? Leave a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Your voice matters.